I always say, I don't know. I could be wrong. I just did it in that physics video. Like, oh, I'm not super deep into physics. I'm not really. This is what it seems like. This is what it seems like. Despite the fact that I say that over and 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 over again, I'll still have. There are retards in my chat right now. You retards will go and post later on my subreddit. Oh, this is just Destiny's problem. He pretends that he knows everything. Oh, Destiny's really arrogant. He thinks he can figure it out. That's not true at all. I don't think I can figure out anything ever. Like, I'm usually like super forthcoming. Like, oh, I don't know about this area. Like I said, but even though I qualify that over and over again, I think it's just because I have a really confident demeanor. People just assume because of my intonation about, oh, he thinks he knows everything.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't have any specific.
Come on, you're doing the thing.
I think that bit of nervousness is like accurate. I don't
because not without an example.
Yeah, it is though.
But you need an example, because if you don't have an example, you're just saying like, remember to breathe.
I think the AGB theory is good and very explanatory and interesting.
Wait, the AGBT or AGB theory of transsexuality is good?
Yeah, I think the typology is quite good.
Jesus.
Okay. I think
writing is for the purpose of communication. Things like grammar should be in service of it. We forget the intention of language rules is to help convey things. If warping a rule makes your intention more clear, break the damn rule. I feel this so much about science. Science is just a process to help us develop more accurate models about the world. There's lots of science rules to help us do this, all the way from best practices to conventions and academic papers. But if science is best done by breaking the rule, then friggin' break it. In my opinion, in every step of our scientific process, we should keep our eyes laser focused on the goal. Does this help develop a more accurate model of the world? That is the one and only question. Everything else is secondary, and so much of current scientific practice is secondary. Coming into awareness about academic science as an outsider, it feels like entering a field where people went to school to learn how to use grammar really, really well, and that you're technically supposed to say, I'm nauseated instead of nauseous, and use the semicolons right. Academia feels like a world where the eye of focus has slipped off of science and onto something that looks like science. In the same way, you might go to school to learn to communicate, learn grammatical rules, and become convinced that grammar is the communication. And you're like, no, I really don't think I need to put the semicolon right here in my essay. It reads better, you feel it more, and they're like, you're not a writer, you're feeling a communication. If you'd gone to school, you would know. This is why we need credentials. Oh, my eyeball. And sure, I get that lots of people are in fact failing at communication because they have failed at learning how to do grammar right. You do have a point, but you're incapable of noticing that the rule is not the goal, and you should drop the rule as soon as it fails the goal. This is kind of true, but this is something that I feel like this is a journey of discovery that people usually go on. Here's what I feel like is a normal journey of discovery. And I could be wrong, but this is just my feelings right now. I feel like a lot of people will step into an area and then you look at something and you're like, these rules are so stupid. I can think of a million ways to improve upon it. And you step into an arena and you're like, I'm gonna do this, this, and this. And these are unconventional and I'm gonna do it and it's gonna be awesome. And you do like one thing and then it works kind of well. And you're like, okay, cool. Then you do another thing. You're like, okay, well, if I do this, this breaks a little bit. So I need to like fix this up. I need to patch this up. And you're like, okay, but it still kind of works. And then time goes on and you try to do another thing. You're like, okay, fuck, hold on. This is really jankety, but I understand that this is like this because this has to be like this and this has to be like this and that has to be like this. And then eventually what you do is you go through from start to finish and you're like, and then by the time you come out the end, you're like, oh, a lot of the convention seems like dog shit, but now I understand as I try to wiggle and change things, there's a reason why things are the way they are, as much as it might suck shit. This is probably, I'm sure like programmers probably go through this when they go to rebuild a code base, or they're like, oh, I can get rid of this or that, or like, we don't need this or this, and then you try to change things, you're like, fuck, okay, this, right? Not to say that all science convention is like that, but I'm sure there's a lot of science convention, or I'm sure there's a lot of convention in general that seems really stupid, that like once it's explained, it's like, oh, okay. Like significant figures to me is an example of something that I remember learning in chemistry that seemed like the dumbest thing in the world. And then after you learn why significant figures exist, you're like, oh, of course, this makes perfect sense. Obviously, like it's necessary. I'm sure there's a lot of things like that. Now it's hard because Aella doesn't give any examples here, so I can't say I agree with her or call her stupid because I just don't know what she's referring to in specifics. But well, apparently my subreddit molded on this. 308 comments. Reads like she just got her first paper rejected and the reviewer said too few contributions, shit methodology. Nice. Okay, so that was a nothing comment. Okay, hold on. I need to get some farm starting. All right. Yeah. Yeah, because I said she doesn't really know what she's doing, and her science is very good. She just has insane access to data, but has no idea how to use it. There's a very good reason data science jobs are typically gated behind degrees, while things like software engineers aren't. The things that drive me crazy about comments like this is just like provide an example. That's why I always say like give an example, because like this comment could be totally true, or the comment could be total dog shit, but I have no way to evaluate it because there's like no examples given. Like, is she actually like shit up on data, or is there something that she's just like incoherent on? Well, like show it, like demonstrate that. She responds, she says, I'm very open about learning as I go and not knowing a lot. That's why I publish exactly what I do, the code I use, and the raw data. I ask people to double check my work. I've noticed that here is something that's very frustrating, and I have this issue as a confident person. And I've noticed this. I'm trying to think if it matters at all. I don't know if it matters at all. When I enter into any field, okay, I say a billion times, and I qualify the out of this. I always say, I don't know. I could be wrong. I just did it in that physics video. Like, oh, I'm not super deep into physics. I'm not really. This is what it seems like. This is what it seems like. Despite the fact that I say that over and 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 over again, I'll still have. There are retards in my chat right now. You retards will go and post later on my subreddit. Oh, this is just Destiny's problem. He pretends that he knows everything. Oh, Destiny's really arrogant. He thinks he can figure it out. That's not true at all. I don't think I can figure out anything ever. Like, I'm usually like super forthcoming. Like, oh, I don't know about this area. Like I said, but even though I qualify that over and over again, I think it's just because I have a really confident demeanor. People just assume because of my intonation about, oh, he thinks he knows everything, despite the fact that me saying otherwise over and over and over and over and over again. This happens like every in my life. And I feel like, and I could be wrong, I might be biased, just because I haven't seen all of her shit. It feels like Aella is generally pretty forthcoming about the shortcomings of her analysis, that she might be missing things, that she says she's like, oh, I'm learning new tools, I don't know how this works. Or there might be posts she's made, I'm even qualifying now and it's not gonna matter. People are gonna come out later and say I blindly defended her. But I'll even qualify now. It might be the case that she does have posts where she's like, oh, I actually think most data scientists are retards, and I figured out like a better way to do statistical analysis of this that other people haven't figured out. She might say that shit, and if she does, then fuck her, right? But I don't know, I haven't seen it, right? But people will just assume. It happened with that Megan lady in comments there, where people were typing underneath. They were like, oh yeah, like Aella thinks she's better than like every other researcher. And I haven't seen her make those comments, and they didn't link any of those comments. But once that like impression is given and set, and people will say just because you seem confident because you're exploring some area, like everybody runs with it. And it's like, oh, okay, well, this is stupid. That's awesome, and I'm glad you're doing that. It's important to know that presenting scientific evidence is a lot like translating a foreign language to the audience's language. The data is saying so many things, and leaving out what the data is saying or misrepresenting makes the whole document questionable. Looking at this like proper grammar is vital. A mistranslation would bring the whole document into question. I don't know what her mentality is. I feel like if I read a comment like this, I'm trying to think if I would permaban a person for saying this to me. If I read that, let's say that I make a statement and somebody comes in and they go, it's really important that you present your knowledge in a way that translates this. Because I feel like, yeah, no shit, Sherlock, obviously. No shit. Why the are you explaining this? I feel like I would ban a person for saying this because it's so obvious that like the only way that you're saying this to me is if you think I'm fucking retarded and you're here to like, thank God, translate this to me. I feel like I think it depends on when I wake up. If I just woken up, if I'd woken up and only gotten like 5 hours of sleep when I read this comment, I think I would ban this person. I'd be like, fuck you. I think I'm probably better than average compared to published social science papers at accurately conveying my data and its limitations, as in stuff like I feel pretty nervous about doing things like presenting only positive results and not negative. If I ever list out, here's the things that correlated, I try to emphasize all the other things I tested for that didn't correlate, and here's what they are. I do think that trying to misinterpret data is hard. I don't claim to be an expert, and I'm paying careful focus on this area. Again, I publish all my raw data so people can tell me if I'm misinterpreting my results, but so far people tend to level very general criticism at me instead of specific ones. For here, I think I would agree with her here actually, but it would be so helpful if she just had like 3 or 4 examples. Like you should just have like 3 or 4 examples. You could do this with a lot of the trans papers that have been published recently for social science papers or whatever. Actually, those are technically medical, right? Or epidemiological, maybe you'd say, where people are saying things like, oh my God, like this particular trans surgery is like so helpful. But then when you actually dig into the data, like the scientists, the researchers themselves are dramatically, a swarm of infected is heading to the colony. Wait, is this like from all sides? The researchers themselves seem to be misrepresenting their own findings. It would be good to have examples like that on hand. It's always good to have examples. Guys, holy shit, always have examples on hand. Be an expert when I'm paying careful focus on I'm talking about your tweets in the screenshot. You're comparing the rigor of grammar in written text to the rigor of the scientific method, but I don't think that's a fair comparison. I think data can be misrepresented or poorly obtained if you circumvent the rules in order to achieve your goal. I think it's already really easy to do that, and it must be actively resisted. Your last sentence in the screenshot makes me particularly worried. Wait, is the kick stream lagging right now? Oh, he did quote it here. Totally fine. Oh, okay. You're comparing the rigor of grammar in written text to the rigor of the scientific method. I don't know what the point of comparing the two was, that grammar only exists to help convey convey better ideas in language, but like the grammar is not the content. The grammar helps express the content. Same thing with the scientific method. The scientific method in and of itself is only in service to the results you produce, right? We have a method because we think it produces the best results. We don't have the method for the sake of having the method. I'm not going to do this all 300 comments. This sounds like a person that sets a goal and works backwards until a narrative is effectively established. What kind of goal are you picturing here? Oh, fuck. So like this is what would trigger me. So this is a comment that is just not true, but it's somebody that's like, I am a great proponent of open science, and I think we could do a lot to include more people in the scientific conversation. In that sense, you're doing an admirable job of getting more people interested, but some of the rules do actually have a meaningful purpose. For example, the way you find participants for your surveys makes it basically impossible to draw any conclusions about the general population. That's not necessarily true. You can always adjust for oversampling when you start to do your analysis of your results. People that complete your surveys are statistically speaking almost certainly not representative of the general population. I mean, like, true, but again, you can adjust for that. Now, you can say that there might be certain adjustments that are impossible. For instance, people that take her survey are almost all probably oversampling for people with access to the internet or social media. That might be true, but I mean, like, to escape that level of sampling, that's going to be really, really hard for a lot of stuff, especially considering so much of psych research is built on like white college students, right? That's just a really difficult thing to escape from. In an ideal world, you would be able to survey, 100,000 people that represent an accurate cross-section of the entirety of the United States. But realistically, like, we're dramatically oversampling in almost all scientific research, except for, say, like maybe like medical trials or something, right? People that complete your surveys, statistically speaking, almost certainly never. So any conclusions you take from them are only valid if your survey takers. A representative sample of just 30 people would probably be better than a systematically biased sample of 10,000. That's almost certainly not true. At numbers, when you're talking 10,000 people, that's a lot of people. What's up? Go.
It depends on if you're able to get statistical power. So, like, if you are able to come to a conclusion, a very representative sample that is smaller is probably better than a non-representative sample that's really big.
It depends on the numbers of people you have in your non-representative samples. You can always control for or adjust or weight results differently, right? I think I'd rather have a dramatically skewed sample size of 100,000 people than a perfect cross-section of 50 people, because on the dramatically skewed larger sample, within that sample, you're probably going to have your like cross-section you look for your small sample. You can just weight the results appropriately, right? If you really needed to. The problem, when you start getting into
familiar with how it's being skewed, there's like a number of things you can do, but I don't exactly know how she's getting her surveys done.
I understand. Wait, this is always the problem, and I think this is the problem that she runs into, is that sentence that you're saying. I don't know what she's doing. It seems like everybody is really keen. Aella, you need to come here and defend, because I'm not going to sound like a simp.
To be clear, I'm not attacking Aella.
No, I
at
understand,
all.
but everything you're saying is essentially that, whether you want it to be or not, right? Because it's always, because I think her issue, and I'm only saying this because she links me shit, and then I look at it, I'm like, it's always people that come and like, well, I don't know what she does, but I really hope that she remembers to breathe, knows that she needs to pee once a day, and then remembers that she needs to eat food or she's going to die. Like, that's every single criticism, and it's happening on my subreddit. Every single criticism that gets levied at her is like, no shit, Sherlock.
I think the criticism is deeper than that. So like you're talking about these rules and why we have rules in place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this very like results forward thinking first, which is good, right? Because like we do care ultimately about the results. But I think that the reason why a lot of people get really anxious when people are willing to break rules, it's because that it's very easy to like choose to break rules in like service of bias.
Okay,
and
again,
not
wait,
know
okay,
about
let's
it.
accelerate past all the really obvious stuff, okay? Yes. If somebody is like, I'm going to go and sample, fucking O Block in Chicago to find out what percentage of Americans like hip hop, okay, then sure, obviously. But I think that if we're going to levy a criticism like this, like, oh, well, you're tossing a rule just to get a certain effect, well, okay, well, what's an example of them doing that? Because if we don't have examples, like, everything you're saying is so painfully obvious. I would imagine, I could be wrong, I'm not wrong, I would imagine Aella would, like, agree with it instantly. She'd say, like, of course. You can't just toss certain rules because you're, like, hunting for certain results. I would imagine,
Yeah, but
right?
the thing is, like, no one thinks they're doing that. So, like, here's what I'll say to, like, Aella. I like Aella. I, like, follow her. I participate in her surveys. I think she's great. I also think that, like,
oh my God, here it
her
comes.
posting her raw data is really good. But I do think that, like, the methodology is important. And so, like, I understand.
Well, sure.
where
So what
people
part of
are
it, what is the
coming from.
criticism you would have, I guess, of some of her methodology?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't have any
come
specific.
on, you're doing the
criticism for her.
thing!
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, yes. Like, I'm not levying a specific criticism at Aella here.
Okay, so but then you're just like speaking these generalities where I would assume that she would probably like, yes, the methodology is important, indeed, right?
Well, no, she's not saying that. She's saying that like it's important to work first from like a results-oriented approach and then develop the methodology second.
No, what she's saying is that it's important that we understand that methodologies only exist in service of getting good results, not thinking of a result we want first and then going after that. I think those are meaningfully different things. Does that make sense?
No, well, explain the meaningful difference.
Okay. This is a big swarm. Hold on. No shot. I'm about to fucking lose this dog shit fucking mission. Hold on, let me pause this. Okay, I'm sorry. So, so let's try to think of a, I'm trying to think of a sign. Let's say that we like have this, I'm gonna do a super hyperbolic example, okay? Let's say that we have like an ethics rule that says that you can't like torture a human as part of like a study unless you get a psych board and the person to consent and all this shit, right? Okay? But then like, let's say that it's like The Last of Us. Have you seen the show and played the game, right?
I've seen the show.
Okay, let's say that it's like The Last of Us, where we find out that like if we kidnap one kid and cut their brain open, we can cure the whole population of some disease, right? Now, we have these ethics guidelines in place that say that we don't do things like this, like non-consensual, like medical research or whatever, right? However, if this was in service of saving the entire human population, we'd probably make an exception here, right? Because this ethics rule that's like causing the whole human population to go extinct probably isn't making very much sense in this case. It's not serving our end goal of like creating happier, healthier humans or whatever, or doing things that are protecting the majority of like human well-being.
Yeah, I think you can find exceptions to rules. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's all she's saying. So like, if you've got, so like, let's say that you have like a certain way of sampling data where you're like, oh, like it's important to keep this particular thing in mind. Like, if your ways of sampling data are so restrictive, or if you're engaged in a practice that's preventing you from doing any research at all, then that particular goal is probably not working well in service to you, like doing research, I would imagine.
So earlier you brought up like representative samples and the ability to account for issues of representation. That is something that like does exist in academia. And like you brought up the trans issue. Trans issue is a great example of this because people do end up with studies, with surveys that are not exactly like representative, but then they proceed to apply all sorts of statistical manipulation to make it more in line with the actual population. So I think that that is like correctly following rules. I wouldn't consider that breaking the rules necessarily. And I think that if you're like being transparent with that is, there's a way you can do that to follow the procedure. So like when I see these people who are getting a little bit nervous with Aella's studies, I think that bit of nervousness is like accurate. I don't
because not without an example.
Yeah, it is though.
But you need an example, because if you don't have an example, you're just saying like, remember to breathe.
Well, I think if someone says that like they're okay with breaking rules, like perhaps only the rules that they're breaking are rules that are like completely ridiculous and they give like very good reasons for it. There's a lot of like criticisms of academics. For example, like the peer review process is sometimes held up as this like unshakable thing that if it's not peer reviewed, like it doesn't count. I don't think that that's probably totally appropriate, because you can have things that are peer reviewed that are, turn out to be totally false. And really, that's been criticized a lot. Like sometimes citations are a better example, and there's all sorts of, discourse on that. So I wouldn't necessarily criticize Aella for like not having peer-reviewed data. I think if she's presenting her surveys and the raw data and her analysis, I think that's great. So that could be like an example of a rule.
Sure, that could be an example, but then I feel like we just need one. I need one. Otherwise, it's like, what is the point of this whole conversation? Right? I think that's the issue, because the issue that she runs into is it's always people like bringing stuff up like this. We're like, well, it could be this, or it could be that, or it could be this. It's like, okay, well, is it? Like, is there something that is there an example? So, for instance, this would be like really powerful. Is there an example of a rule that she's broken that she shouldn't have broken, or is there an example of her saying like, I don't like to follow this particular standard that she should be following? That would be like, and then once you say that, it's like, okay, cool, like that's a good example of something, but.
I think it's the representativeness is the big one, right? That everyone talks about.
Yeah, but we all know you don't necessarily need a representative sample, right? You can control away, or you can weight or adjust results based on that. And also
there are ways for her to get a representative sample. For example, if she conducted her surveys differently. I know that there have been some studies. How? So there's been some studies that have had success using like targeted advertisement. So they actually like have a lot more data from where they're putting out the survey to, and it's not just like on a Twitter or something, but you'll actually put it through like Facebook ads. You can get like a much bigger net that way that is not necessarily tailored to your followers. So that would be like one example of like a small thing she could do that might make her studies a lot more robust. Now, I'm not saying that like she can't have any interesting findings if she doesn't do that, but if she were to try different survey methods, that could be an option that creates more representative samples.
I guess it could, but I feel like, again, you can run into like all of these issues in terms of like where your ads are drawing from, because she already cross-posts to places like Facebook and shit anyway, no?
Well, is she cross-posting on like her account, or is it actually like?
I think she asks other people to post for her.
Yeah, that's also an issue. Because the kind of people who post it are going to be a certain type of person. I know that.
I don't necessarily disagree with this, but like the kind of person that does anything is going to always. It's like none of this is going to be perfect. Like all of this could be like fucked, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're never going to have a perfectly representative sample, but there are methods that get you, closer or less close.
You should argue with her over it. You should debate her on it.
Okay. I don't know. So like. I would love to talk to her about it, but I'm kind of coming into it like halfway through, because I don't know exactly what studies people are angry about. I just know that like, yeah, rules tend to be there for a reason, and a lot of times when we have rules, they exist because it's so easy to justify breaking them.
Wait, okay, let's skip all this. We know this, obviously. Obviously. Rules exist for a reason. Convention exists for a reason. People can justify breaking any rule if they want to get a certain type of result. That's obvious. Obviously, right?
Yeah, I have this issue with like utilitarians and stuff too. It's just like results first, backward thinking that tends to result in some pretty bad stuff.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna go drag Aella into this, and it's gonna be Death Arena time.
Okay, Death Arena time. I need a drink.
Hold on 1 second.
Hello?
Aella. Hello.
Hello.
Oh my god.
So Aella, if you want to fill me in, a lot of people are having, quote unquote discourse about your studies and how valid they are scientifically. One of the criticisms that I think people bring up to you is this issue of representativeness, whether or not your surveys actually represent the general population. I know that one of the ways you can account for this is weighting, right? So if you know more or less how it's biased, you can weight it in different ways. What's your process for that?
Yeah, at the moment, I am not weighting it because I want to be very careful before I apply any manipulations to the data until I'm like, and I know very thoroughly what I'm doing. So in lieu of that, I'm saying exactly the populations that I'm measuring and not claiming to represent populations beyond that.
Okay, amazing, right? Because this is kind of my point. I agree with you. I think this is a good strategy because you're just being very transparent and honest about the issues. And like, if you weight things wrongly, that's very easy to do. If you, for example, don't know what direction your study is biased in. If you knew that, you could weight it in good ways. But also, like, I think that if you're not choosing to weight your survey, it is not representative, right? And you're not even claiming it to be, right?
Well, I think, like, generally, there's like levels of confidence you can claim about representation, and it depends on the kind of thing that you're surveying. Like, for example, if you're surveying like the correlation between height and weight, it's like pretty easy to check for me whether or not this is like representative. It's like kind of obvious because this is very straightforward. Whereas there's like other things that might be confounded, especially through the kind of people who follow me. Like, for example, I'm a sex worker, right? So anything like regarding like maybe sex and liberal views, like, are you polyamorous and are you happy? Like, these things I think are a little bit more susceptible. I think people have done like studies to see the kind of like reliability you have on convenience samples, and it seems to like correlate, support this. Like, the more biased it is, or like the more it correlates with the kind of population you're sampling, then the less you can trust it.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. You understand like why people are a little bit like nervous about some of your studies, right? And why people don't want to necessarily take them at face value, because of your willingness to just like present the raw data and be very, I think you're pretty careful, frankly, with the conclusions that you come to. Like you said, they're pretty limited to the scope of the survey and the limitations that come with your style of survey. However, I think that like people are also on the other side. It is legitimate then to look at those limitations and then be like, this is cool, but I'm not necessarily going to take this as having the same kind of meaning as a study that has accounted already for these limitations.
Well, if you're like, okay, I look at the data that you gave me, I see this correlation, but actually I know the kind of populations you surveyed, and I think it's likely that that kind of population is going to show a correlation that's not necessarily there when you survey the general population. I think this is a good critique. I'm like, okay, I think this is like legit. Maybe there are ways we can figure this out. But like a lot of people seem to like assume I'm making larger claims than I am and respond to me based on that. Like, I see this very regularly. People are like, like, Aella's like, she can't say that her survey's representative. I'm like, I never say that. I never say that. But I think people like kind of view me as like overreaching when like the actual, if you look at the actual things that I say, if you look at actually my blog posts and the kinds of ways that I talk about my data, it is quite careful. And so I think people are sort of responding to like this illusory version of me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So Aella, what is a rule that you think that you break if it's not representativeness? Because I've read studies before that they don't have representative samples, and they just make like a note of that. And as far as I'm aware, that is within the rules of even academic peer-reviewed published papers.
I don't have the correct consent form at the beginning of my surveys, which precludes me from being able to be published in major journals. I don't format things in PDFs with the correct like spacing on the sides. I use different terminology, like I say internet survey instead of convenience sample. Just like a bunch of different, like there's no way that my
like
current
literal
publication,
grammar rules in some cases.
Yeah, in some cases literal grammar rules, yeah.
I wonder if there would be less drama if it was like, if you did give these literal examples. For example, like, I don't use this precise formatting. And to some extent, I think it's kind of like the representative issue, where I can think of ways that would be pretty easy to implement that would make these things therefore fit within the rules. I wouldn't necessarily give like a major critique, certainly not of you as a person, or of necessarily the study, if there's like a grammar issue. But I do think that like it would help if you did follow some of these rules, if for no other reason, just because you probably could get published if you made these small changes. And in the case of representativeness, they might actually have a pretty meaningful positive impact on the work.
I feel like a little bit mixed feelings about this. Like, one, I think a lot of these rules sort of are bad for science. One example I gave in one of the comments is that I use the term internet survey, and somebody else was critiquing doing internet surveys, and then went on to publish or to talk about to cite a study that was done using an internet survey, but they didn't know it was an internet survey because they used the term convenience sample. And I think a lot of published studies use terminology that is completely not interpretable to the general population. And in this case, so this is one example of where I don't want to sacrifice interpretability in order to get published. I would rather keep things informal and direct. Anybody can sit down and run a survey and just publish the raw data and be this, I studied this population, this is what they said.
So,
and I think that this is important
against saying there's an internet survey. You can say that. There are lots of studies that do make it clear that they found their data through internet surveys or through internet advertising. I think that if you use convenience sample, that's just, maybe that's technical jargon. Personally, I wouldn't even know. I wouldn't automatically assume that was an internet survey. So that is a limitation of me as a layman as well. But I've also read plenty of other studies that are very clear. And I think that I can't imagine that you're not being published because you're breaking the rule of mentioning things are internet surveys.
So I'm not actually clear. A lot of my interpretation, understanding of how this works, is by talking to academic friends. I have never actually tried to get published myself. It's possible that I could break a lot of the norms of academic publishing and they would still publish me. But the impression I've got from talking to academics when I'm oh, maybe I should try and publish some of my findings, is they kind of wince and be I'm not sure that they would let you. Due to things things that are kind of stupid, you didn't use the correct verbiage in the consent form at the beginning of the survey, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if it's small things like that, your tweet can really just be there are certain grammar expectations for certain publications. But as far as I'm aware, there is nothing in academic journals that says it is a rule that you can't mention that you had an internet survey or you have to refer to it as a convenience sample. That maybe there is a very specific journal that says that you must refer to internet surveys as a specific terminology. If that's the case, you can read the journal's requirements and just update your language for it. But I don't know if that is that isn't a rule in the broader scientific community that I think is worth really railing against. Maybe there are other rules though that you there's some of the grammar stuff.
Maybe me. If it is true that the reason a lot of studies are written the way that they are is not because you have to do that in order to get published, but rather because people are kind of just doing that because, I don't know, they suck at communicating, then I would be mistaken, and then I think I would update my view here. But I was under the impression that you had to adhere to certain types of communication in order to get published, based on me just reading surveys and published studies and them having a bunch of things in common that I find to be not great.
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to depend on the thing. So you mentioned ethics and having consent forms and whatnot. I'm going to guess that the languaging there needs to be pretty precise as far as what you're doing, because there's ethical concerns about making sure people know how the survey is going to work, how the data is going to be used and whatnot. I think that those ethical concerns I think they're legitimate, quite frankly. But I also think that probably most people will get what you're getting at, especially if you're using more natural language. But you also have to understand that these publications, they are taking on liability when they're publishing material that you've surveyed. And in order for them to be comfortable taking on that liability, there are certain guidelines that they have to uphold by, that they have to stand by. I think that that's pretty legitimate. I also think that that is not exactly to some extent, some of these issues that you're talking about, formatting things. I don't know if you mentioned spacing. That's something that probably varies from journal to journal and is not the biggest deal to me. I don't know if I would phrase that as a rule of science necessarily. So I do think that when you go on Twitter and you phrase things a certain way, it is legitimate for people to get a little bit nervous if you're saying I'm willing to break all of these rules. If the rules that you're talking about are very minor, that's another thing. But if they're major, that is something to be a little bit concerned about.
But I specified that I'm willing to break rules that are getting in the way of truth finding. That's a very precise definition, which I was very clear about in my tweets.
I disagree that that's a precise definition. And the reason I disagree is because different people will have different ideas about what is going to stand in the way of truth finding. And listen, you may be perfect, right? Like, and you're never going to introduce bias or issues here. But I think in general, the scientific community and the rules that people place on publications, they exist because we don't want to trust every individual to decide for themselves what is going to be in service of truth finding, because that results in some people engaging in bad behaviors. Again, I'm not going to say you're doing that. I haven't seen evidence of you doing that, but I do think it's reasonable for people to get a little bit nervous if they hear that that is your way of thinking, especially because even if nothing bad is happening now, that methodology could lead to something bad in the future.
I guess so. I'm like surprised that like my tweets resulted in this. Like in my view, people are just sort of finding like the worst possible interpretation. But also there's this thing where like I do wonder to what degree academics are biased because they went through like a very costly and time-consuming process where they had to learn a bunch of like ritualistic behaviors. And so are like a little bit biased against people doing some sort of challenging to the status quo. And to be clear, I think there's absolutely this thing where like people are like, hey, you know what, academics are biased. It's like the liberal establishment. And then they like distrust all of science and think that they can like do their own research and then are quite bad at it. Like I think that this is a real thing. And it's like makes sense to try to be guarding against this thing. But I think I'm like quite far from that. Like if you like read any one of the things that I've published, I think it's pretty obvious that I'm quite far from that. Forgot where I was going.
Well, the other thing that I quite like about what you do is that you're pretty transparent, both with the data you collect and the limitations of what you have. So I think that if you're doing that, to some extent, if people are taking your surveys as gospel or as like representative of the whole population, before you've even begun like the weighting process to account for any kind of bias, to some extent, I think that is on them. And there is this like scientific communication thing where you're being like very transparent in your communication in a way that frankly sometimes journals are not. So like I've debated the trans stuff a lot, and sometimes they will reference like, oh, I got this from an internet survey, and then you'll go to like the survey makers, you'll read the report, and at the very end they'll say like in one paragraph like this is not representative, but that's not mentioned at all in the actual publication that is peer reviewed and on a journal. That's a really big problem for me, and that is like arguably worse than what you're doing here, even though it exists within like general science. So I think to some extent like the rules could be stricter in some ways, and also you're not necessarily breaking rules here when you're being very clear. In fact, like you are exceeding the rules expected by some publications. Right. I think I have to like commend you for that.
Like because my thing is that like if you actually want to pursue finding, you should probably place stricter rules in place for transparency, which journals are not doing. Like in some ways, I think like journals are failing to be actually interested in finding truth by having a lack of rules, and in other places they have an excess of rules.
That seems right to me. Is there an example you can think of where journals are like systematically failing in this way?
Oh, I can think of an example.
Yeah, go, Stephen.
Well, I don't know why. I'm sure there's a reason. Why is it that for a lot of data, or for a lot of peer-reviewed journals, why don't you ever have to make the raw data publicly available? I can understand in terms of like proprietary research maybe, but other than that, is there a reason? Is there a good reason for that? Like I would imagine for almost every social science thing, it'd probably be advantageous for us to have availability of raw data. In fact, for some of the really big ivermectin studies, availability of the raw data was how people were able to invalidate how bullshit a lot of the studies were, because you could use like pretty crude algorithms to figure out that a lot of the data entry was bogus. Like some of the copy paste in medical like fields, it made it obvious that there was like a lot of duplicated entries and shit to try to get a certain result.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that to some extent it might just be like a concision thing. I know that if you email the publishers or the actual like authors of the study, a lot of times they will give you raw data. So I follow like some people's Substacks who will like review studies. And one of the ways they do that is by like asking authors for raw data. And whenever the authors are like unwilling to provide it, that is kind of like, it's a little bit sketchy, but I don't think that like they have necessarily an obligation to. I think the expectation is that like this raw data is being already reviewed.
Yeah, as part of the peer review process, but like
right.
realistically, like I don't know, it seems like it'd be better to make it available. Like why not?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree, especially on that one. Especially because the peer reviewed process can be so flawed. And a lot of times you will get studies that are, you know, quote unquote peer reviewed, but it turns out that the peer review was just not very rigorous at all.
There's also this thing where I feel like selection bias is applied as a criticism, like not super intelligently. Like I agree that it's super nuanced, it's very important, and there are lots of like very clear examples where certain subpopulations are not representative of larger ones. But there's this thing where it's like, if you find like a correlation, if like, you know, for example, let's say I survey a bunch of people on TikTok and I find that people who had like this very specific childhood experience end up being really interested in foot fetishes. It feels to me that like there's kind of a like what kind of world would we be in which this correlation only exists in a subpopulation and not a larger population? Like there's like it's possible for there to be correlations that exist where it would feel stranger to me for them to be limited to a subpopulation. Does this make sense? Am I explaining myself right?
Yeah, I think you are.
I would say for stuff like that, I think this is the scary part where certain biases could creep in and obfuscate in very, very, very strange ways that would make it hard. So, for instance, like, I'm going to stretch really hard here, but like, let's say that like 65% of TikTok downloads are actually driven by like a specific subset of programs on Nickelodeon that happen to have like a lot of creators that do like a lot of beach scenes where they have their feet out, and that's like a big driver to like developing foot fetishes or whatever. You might end up showing that like, oh, well, I've got a pretty strange correlation that people with some set of childhood experiences like early access to the internet have developed like these particular things, but in reality it's because the driver to that platform that was being surveyed is actually what was causing it. Like that's like an example, and I'm sure there are a lot of like other weird like sneaky kind of like correlated things that can drive different population groups to having like different things. It maybe would be hard to just even fathom initially. Yeah.
But I agree that like this is a thing that we should be pretty careful in, and like we shouldn't make strong claims based on this. But I'm saying if we have a correlation, we can lay out a bunch of hypotheses. Like maybe have like all the downloads are driven by like people who have their feet out, or like maybe we're like having this weird selection effect. But like often when it comes to like a specific correlation, and I lay out all of the possibilities that could cause this, most of them seem relatively unlikely.
Sure.
And if they were the case, that would be really fascinating. Like I'm like, oh dude, wait, TikTok is being driven by like people who have their feet out. Like this in itself would be like a really interesting novel like conclusion. So I'm like, usually when people accuse some finding of selection bias, a lot of the times it can be obvious. Like for example, I did like what are cheating rates among people in my followers. And I could see a pretty easy argument that, well, like, Aella, you do porn. People who follow you are going to be less sexually satisfied in their relationships and thus more likely to cheat. This seems like kind of an obvious thing. Like, we could kind of check that. But this is like a very clear, like, okay, this seems like a likely hypothesis to me. But most of the other ones, like, really, I'm like, okay, if we're really scraping the bottom of the barrel hypothesis here. And I'm not saying, again, that we should come to, like, strong conclusions, but I'm saying that, like, it feels like there's at some point we hit, like, a common sense intuitive thing where it's like, okay, I don't know for certain that your survey is, like, proving this thing, but it feels like it's pointing in a really interesting direction. And maybe we should do another, like, representative survey just to, like, confirm it. But, like, just the fact that it's pointing in an interesting direction, to me, feels super valuable.
I think it is. The problem, though, is that a lot of times, like, the bias is hard to figure out beforehand. And this is something that we already talked about when we talked about weighting samples, depending on how you think it might be biased, if you know how it's biased, you can do that weighting like successfully. For example, if you know that you've got like a lot of old people in the survey, and you're not actually like, you might be like overweighting for the opinions of old people. Well, you can like adjust for that in the actual data. And that would be an example of bias that's like pretty obvious. But I think that the issue is precisely with biases that would be like novel and interesting and strange. And so like with those types of biases, that is like really the risk of having survey data that that is not representative, is all of the ways that it might be biased in which you don't know, because otherwise you could wait for it. So I think that that is really the kind of deeper criticism.
The novel and interesting and strange part is in itself awesome. Like, for example, I just did, like, in my kink survey, I asked people about like mental health. I said, do you have a mental health problem? And there were really high to this among non-cis females. And one hypothesis is non-cis females have really high levels of mental illness, and another hypothesis maybe they're more likely to self-report it, or like there's something going on in like self-identity narrative that like lends itself more towards like perceptions of this. And these are two completely different hypotheses. One would be like a biased thing, right? Like I'm like accidentally surveying a population. Like for example, like TikTok is like more likely to be, to think of yourself as like mentally ill in some way. But that in itself seems super cool. Like I don't like finding a correlation where we don't know what the answer is. It's not obvious, like whether it's through selection bias or whether it's like indicating some sort of like straightforward thing. Like both of those seem super fascinating to me. Like that seems to be super valuable in and of itself. Like if it, like, the selection bias might be a result of some sort of like arcane and obscure thing, like that's the whole point too, right? Like it's pointing in that as a potential direction for inquiry.
Yeah, I think you're right. And part of that is the language you use to talk about it. So if you use this kink survey to then say something about specifically the population that was surveyed, I think you can say something a little bit more meaningful. Like if you incorporate where you surveyed people from. So you might find out that like, on Twitter, there you get like certain survey results. You can say like, people who responded from Twitter have all of these views. And it might be really interesting and novel and perhaps strange that Twitter users happen to be like far different from the general population. And that is worth exploring. So I think that like if you're limiting your language to talk about Twitter people, that's legitimate. But I also think that that is not really like, I wouldn't consider that necessarily breaking like scientific rules. You're just being like, transparent with the kind of people that you're surveying and saying and limiting your observations to the population that is in question instead of the broader population. I think it would only be breaking rules if then you said that like people in general, not just like the people who people who may be on Twitter who are doing this. However, like the other problem here, and this is something that like we keep going back to, is that like even if you like know that this is just like only Twitter people, that might be like one source of bias that you know about, but again there might be like other sources of bias that you don't know about. So then when you speak about like the population being surveyed, there might be like some other explainer that I think like Destiny is talking about you haven't considered. And so that is just like always the risk here. Again, like I don't want to make this like personal.
Make it personal. Frankly, it's about her. The whole Twitter thread is about her.
Well, I quite like Aella's stuff, and like I followed her for a little while, and so.
Oh, meaning you don't follow her anymore? What happened?
No, I still follow her. I still like put in little survey answers.
So weak.
But, I mean, so like if it were personal, I think it would be like I'd be more soft on Aella, if anything. I don't know what I was saying. I quite like her. I don't think this is like a personal thing. And I think if anything, she does things like pretty well compared to other people. But I also understand where people are coming from. Just like that little bit of nervousness if someone is willing to break rules.
What do you think about that, Aella? She says she thinks you're breaking rules for no fucking reason.
Yeah, I think you're a complete idiot. It's terrible, disgusting, the worst.
What do you think if I interpreted my own Twitter thread differently, then I would be concerned.
But you just think people are being a little bit unfair with their interpretations.
I mean, at some level, it's like, how can somebody be unfair when, like, we have no free will, and of course people are going to interpret it the way they do. But this is like a recurring theme with me. It's like I use language, and what I feel to be is like quite precise and intentional, and then people interpret it differently than the way that I meant, and this happens all the time. And then people spread like rumors about like the things that I'm doing, or think the things that I think, and then I'm like, okay, I used very specific language here, and I meant exactly what I meant within the scope of that language. But this is a recurring problem with me because I guess I regularly use language differently than other people.
Well, I will say, maybe I'm also just like, I will say I did not interpret the way you were talking about breaking rules as the way you meant it. I thought you were breaking more fundamental rules than, for example, like what language specifically you use to refer to like an internet survey, or specific like, formatting rules. I thought you were talking about something deeper than that. Not deep as in like meaningful, just like something broader, I guess, than that. So I also was a victim of like misinterpreting what you said.
Oof. She's challenging your
very
ability to communicate.
Like, dude, you're such a you're not such a mud fight right now.
It does. What do you think of AGP? Autogynephilia?
Oh yeah. What do I think of it?
Yeah, what do you think of it?
Well, some people yelled at me because I guess there's very precise definitions of AGP, and the thing that I think of it is like, you are aroused by the thought of yourself as a woman, and it could be like either sexually or non-sexually. But I did some. Did you read the thing I wrote about it? I'm not sure if that's what you're referencing.
I don't think so. I'm just, if Destiny wants
She's
like
just shit-stirring right now. She's trying to get you canceled by trans Twitter. Okay.
I think the AGP theory is good and very explanatory and interesting.
Theory? Wait, the LGBT or AGB theory of transsexuality is good?
Yeah, I think the typology is quite good.
Jesus.
Or, well, okay. I think, no, to be clear, I think AGP is quite good. I think HSTS is more dubious.
Okay. Do you feel like you have adequately... sorry, go ahead.
I found that trans people seem to report higher levels of autogynephilia than other people. My guess is that it applies pretty strongly for some trans people and not for others. Like, my guess is there's probably subtypes.
Yeah, this is my sense as well. You can kind of do like a grouping of AGP people, but there are other motivations to transition. I don't necessarily think that HSTS is like the strongest one, but there are definitely like a variety of motivations. And this is something that I think
what
that
is
even
HSTS?
like... Oh, I'm sorry. Homosexual, transsexual. So like Blanchard, way back when he was writing all of his papers, he posited that there were two types of transsexuals, two types of motivation for transitioning that differed just from merely gender dysphoria. One of them was autogynephilia, which is like erotic target location error, where you basically like are aroused at the idea of being a woman, and this motivates you to be transitioning. The alternative was that there are people who are just very, very feminine gay men, and in order to like fit in, to avoid social stigma, they transition as well. He actually said that like gender dysphoria plays a role in both of these, and it's really when you have the confluence of multiple motivating factors that people transition. So personally, like I feel that like AGP is one motivating factor in my own transition, and a lot of the trans women that I've spoken to also feel this way. I think it's a little bit frustrating that this has been like so buried scientifically, because it is a field of study that I think could be explored a lot more, and where people could learn a lot more about themselves. I also think that it's probably like less, fetishy than people think it actually is. That's something that like, there's this person named Phil Lilly who like talks a lot about this. I could go very deep into it, but that is kind of the overview of what these typologies are.
Yeah, it's also my guess that like I personally don't care if it is a fetish. Like, if we did the studies and found out that in fact this is a fetishistic thing, then I don't think we should be treating trans people with respect.
I think the worry is that, like, if you're involving people in a fetish.
No, I think it's more than that. I think the conversation is, well, there's two parts. One is if you should have access to free medical treatment to alleviate a fetish.
Yeah.
And then the second obvious one is going to be, should kids be exploring that fetish under a surgeon's scalpel or drug therapy? I think that would be a really big deal. Like, nobody in society has an issue with somebody getting plastic surgery. Well, I mean, some people might, but like, but the question is a lot meaningfully different when it's like, you know, should we be paying for people to have plastic surgery as part of their like mandated healthcare because it's like medically necessary? I think.
Like if you take away if we just taboo the word fetish, because I'm very into tabooing words. Like, and if the thing that happens is like, if you have a person go through surgery, puberty, and this like reliably results in a better quality of life afterwards. Like, shouldn't that just be the only important factor?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think the answer to that is very clear, right?
Yes.
Let's say, for instance, we'll do the foot fetish one again. Let's say that we could find a way that you could actually attach a foot to somebody's like fucking arm surgically. And then and people were like killing themselves because they couldn't masturbate to people's feet because now everybody's wearing socks and sandals or something, right? Let's say, would we start like surgically attaching feet to people's elbows so that they could look at them when they're like 15 so that they don't kill themselves because they can't masturbate? I'm pretty far out there with an example right now, but I feel like, I don't know if this is a reasonable request or if it's just like an emotional one that I need to explore more, but it feels to me like most people probably need there to be a more medically necessary cause to support trans things rather than just like, this is a sexual thing that some people get off on.
To be clear, Blanchard, when he posited these studies, his opinion is that trans people also have gender dysphoria, which is like an underlying psychological issue, which makes it that is separate from their paraphilia, their sexual interests. So even if they're asexual, they're going to have an impulse or, you know, a dysphoria associated with their natural sex.
Yeah, that's true. But then here's a question that I would have about the AGP studies, and I haven't read them, so I don't know. But it would be like a methodology question. Is like, is it possible that there are things that a cis person would count as AGP, but they're not because they're cis, but trans people are more likely to do it? Yeah. So actually there have been studies where you give like cis women the questions to like an AJP survey, and it will be certain things like, are you aroused when you put on like stockings and lingerie, things like that. And it turns out that like when you give these studies to cis women, they indicate very highly for AGP. However, those studies, there's like an issue with them, which is that like it's probably not unusual for a cis woman to imagine that she's a woman in her fantasies. In fact, that's totally expected. So actually what we're talking about with AGP, I think, is a kind of autosexuality where AGP people would be auto-heterosexual, and cis women, they're not actually engaging in like auto-heterosexuality in the way that AGPs are. They are just like engaging in imagining themselves in the situation. And to some extent, like if you have like arousal at yourself, if anything, that might be like auto homosexuality. Well, how do you, I'm just so curious, how do you separate that out? Like, I would probably have like arousal of myself to some, like if I film a video of like me and Melina or some girl like messing around, I'm gonna like, that's hot to me, but like, does that count as auto arousal? Or if I'm masturbating and I'm getting off to kind of myself, but I'm thinking of myself in another situation, is that like self arousal? Or like how do you measure? It might be. Yeah, but how do you figure that out? I'm curious, how do you tease that out?
Well, okay, so like if we imagine like most guys when they're looking at pornography, there's like a way that you can look at pornography where if you were watching the man, the woman, and you were imagining yourself as having like these muscles and this strong masculine energy, and just that imagination is arousing you, not necessarily imagining being the kind of guy who a woman, right? Because then you are like incorporating this other partner, and the arousal is stemming from like the actual sexual act and the person you are doing it to. That is different from being like aroused at the idea of yourself being a particular man. So like with my autogynephilia, I think that like part of the arousal stems from imagining that I'm like a particular woman in the scenario, regardless of like the scenario that she's in, but just because of who she is, right? So that is kind of like how I tease it out in myself. You're right that this is difficult to tease out in studies, but I do think that there is like a difference between being aroused or like imagining yourself having sex as a woman if you're a cis woman, because that is just like the default mode. It's not necessarily indicative of particular arousal at that imagination or just because you're imagining yourself. Versus if it's a trans woman doing it, there might be some indication that they are particularly aroused by this like change of perspective going from like male to female in the sexual scenario. But I also think that it's better to couch the discussion in terms of sexuality. I think this explains a lot of trans women's feelings. For example, a lot of trans women will feel more AGP at the beginning of their transition. They might like put on women's clothing and become aroused by that fact very early on, but find that that disappears quite quickly. And there's actually like this honeymoon period that goes along with it. So when you first start doing it, you're very excited, you're very, easily aroused by the idea of dressing a certain way. But a few years in, that kind of passion has dissipated, and it is more like a long-term companionship relationship. That might be like a better explanation of this. I don't know if we probably don't want to go like super deep into AGP, but
sure,
you should study it, Aella, because it's fascinating.
Yeah, I asked a couple like AGP-ish questions in my survey. My sample size is quite big, but it was very limited because the survey was focused on other things, so did not get to dive too deep into it.
Well, where are you at right now? Do you say?
Me?
Yeah.
In the world?
Yeah, or what are you doing? Because you're on a microphone and yeah.
I'm in Edinburgh, which is apparently how you're supposed to pronounce it.
Uh-huh. What are you doing
Scotland.
out there?
My sister is showing me around because she really likes the city, and I'm going over to Montenegro for some shit.
Cool. Wow. Chills. I don't know what else to say.
Good question, Stephen.
I'm just trying to move the conversation along, okay? Fuck you.
Oh, is that the... Okay. Okay, maybe I should go now because it's kind of... And I don't think I have anything more to say.
I don't think so.
If you feel like you got your points out, yeah. I don't want to keep it.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think if I wanted to just reiterate one thing, it would be just, like, look what like, I actually say in my surveys. Don't, like, assume I'm saying something that I'm not. Just to everybody, not to you guys.
Okay.
That's it.
Cool. Sounds good.
Okay.
Have fun.
Thanks, guys.
Be careful.
Bye-bye.
What a bitch.
All right.
I think she's hiding from all your real criticisms, okay?
Yeah, exactly.
I can't believe you let her get away with saying common sense. You need to nail her to the wall for that. Unbelievable. You're simping
I didn't want to nail her to the
hard.
wall.
Mm-hmm.
What if we become best friends in the future? Okay, I gotta leave that door open.
Okay.
All right, see you, Stephen.
That's it? What would you come in here to talk to me about?
Oh, I mean, I wanted to talk to you about that. I guess there's this like broader point. Have you ever heard the metaphor of the elephant and the rider?
Yeah, I know all the metaphors, but explain them for my
Okay.
chat for those that don't know about that one.
Those of you who don't know, there's this metaphor in kind of psychology where of the elephant and the rider. And I was talking to one of your chatters, like the guy who called and was talking about like building belief systems about this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to pull up the broader description.
Hope you give Brittany another chance. I believe it would be good for you to acknowledge that people see you as emotional.
Hold on, wait.
It's okay. The world isn't collapsing, if that is true to some extent. Anyway, keep up the good work.
Okay, sorry. Don't know. Okay.
Wow, based.
Yeah.
Okay, so the metaphor is something like your personality is comprised of two elements. So there's the elephant and the rider. The rider is intelligent, he's thoughtful, he's careful, he's very lucid. The elephant is lazy and temperamental and kind of just does whatever he wants. And I think that anyone who has ever thought to themselves, like, I really ought to do this thing, I really ought to get my homework done or work out or whatever, and then proceeded exactly to not do that, they've experienced this kind of like dual personality structure where the problem is that the elephant, the part of your brain that is kind of lazy and capricious and more susceptible to base desires, is much stronger than like the overriding rational part of your brain. And even though you rationally recognize that certain things are better or worse for you, it's very easy to just like go with the flow of bias. And this is like a general problem with people. Humans are extremely biased. I know what you mean, yeah. Well, yeah, mere mortals. This is a big issue where people tend to be really biased and really bad at actually doing the things that they believe in. So like, I think this is a big problem with utilitarianism, or at least like kind of vulgar utilitarianism, the utilitarianism that is
oh my god, isn't Aella a big effective altruism person? Oh, you should have fucked her on that.
Yeah, I should have argued with her about that. But I think that like the problem with utilitarianism is that it tells people that the essence of morality exists within a certain kind of utility calculus, and that's something that the rider, the rational part of your brain, is really good at. But it doesn't matter if the rational part of your brain can calculate all day and write pages and pages of analytical philosophy proving its point. At the end of the day, you're going to go in the direction of your elephant, of the biases within you and your laziness and your impulses. And so I think that this is connected to the idea of rules. I think that the way to overcome this is to habitually practice rules, even when they don't perfectly make sense. So even if, for example, you don't need to format something a specific way, when you format things a specific way, or when you take like a cold shower, or you force yourself to wake up at 7 a.m., you are teaching yourself discipline. You are controlling the elephant in some way, and that is going to transfer over to more important things. So what you have to do is you have to really practice like a set of ethical principles all the time, to the point where they are no longer something that you recognize merely intellectually, but something that is realized within your body. And that is something that people really struggle with, because rationally it doesn't make sense why you need this thing or that thing, because when you reason back from your end goal, the rule is actually not that important. The end goal is what's important. However, I think that in order to fully realize ethics, you have to convince yourself almost that the rules are like important in of themselves, and aim for the rules, because that will push you in the right direction, rather than starting with a direction and trying to just navigate your way through whatever maze is in between you and your goal.
Yikes, that's pretty cringe, bro.
So that was that is a broader reason to pursue rules.
Okay. Does this sound a little bit virtue-y?
Yeah, it does. A little bit like virtue ethics.
Yeah, I think I largely agree. So, like, there's, like, stupid things that, like, a lot of the Red Pill guys say this shit, but it's like, I take a cold shower in the morning or something, right? Mm-hmm. Which in and of itself is kind of fucking retarded and it's stupid. But the idea... There's no evidence to suggest that it's, yeah, like, and it's not even about evidence. It's about, like, doing something hard. But there's actually probably some validity to being able to set up, like, a rigorous routine like that you can take even, like, a normal task, turn it into some arduous process, and then overcome it every single morning. Probably, like, shapes, like, a state of mind that's able to be more resilient in the world or something, right? So even if it's like a stupid thing like that wouldn't pass like a utilitarian check or some other type of check, maybe it ultimately is something that's kind of beneficial, you know?
Yeah, I think that you had this like great line when you were talking maybe to Sneeko way back about maybe like C.S. Lewis or something, and you said that like you have to shape yourself
with every action or whatever.
With every action into like the kind of person who is ethical. Mm-hmm. And that is like very much true, where if your goal is just, a future utility calculus, you can be the kind of person who is not able to get there and believe yourself to be, total master of your destiny, while meanwhile just like totally failing to achieve it.
Mm-hmm. True. Aella would like to go on record stating she is not an EA nerd. She's even worse. She's a rationalist nerd. My bad. I didn't know there was overlap.
Oh, I bet she reads Slate Star Codex and stuff.
She's like Miss Slate Star Codex, okay? Yeah, that's her. She defines her existence that way, yes.
Yeah. She has Scott Alexander tattooed on herself. To be fair, I also read it, so. Oh. Okay, that was all. I don't think there's much else.
Okay.
Good luck with Kick.
Thanks a lot. Be careful.
that.